Hey everyone, this is the short lecture on Paley. Um, Before I get into the main argument, I want to say first that the point of the watch analogy is not that the watch is a metaphor for time or for the rushed pace of modern life or anything like that. The point of the watch analogy is explicitly to be contrasted with the stone. So here's the idea, right? If we see a stone lying out in a field somewhere, and somebody says, "Hey, what's that stone doing there?" We don't think anything's weird about saying, it just happens to be there. It fell that way, or it just shows up by chance. But if there's a watch out somewhere just lying on the ground and someone says, "How did that come to be there?" We don't think, "Oh, well, it just happens to be that way," or "it showed up by chance," or anything like that. Instead, our minds demand a certain kind of explanation, right? A watch is an intricate, orderly object that is made to work in a certain way. And so we think, if we see a watch like that, that someone must have owned it, and that in particular, someone must have designed it and created it to be that way. This is supposed to be straightforwardly an analogy to the world around us, right? The universe. The universe is an orderly and intricate place. Things happen in lots of interesting little ways. Everything seems to be working together. And so Paley thinks, look, just like the watch, we shouldn't think, "Oh, it just happens to be here by chance." We should think, this intricate, orderly place has a designer. And that's really it. That's the whole argument, is just this analogy to the watch. Since the watch needs a designer, the world needs a designer. And of course, that designer is supposed to be God. Now, there's a lot more that's going on in the Paley, but the vast majority of it is him, Paley, raising lots of different objections to his own argument that he would foresee, and then answering those objections. So, for example, the idea that maybe there are watches that are so intricate that they can make other watches, right? They're reproducing watches. That is supposed to be an objection to the idea that we need to invoke a designer, right? Because if watches reproduce themselves, then maybe we don't have to talk about a designer of the watch. We can just talk about a series of watches, each of which reproduces the next one. But Paley says, look, if we found a watch like this, a reproducing watch, we wouldn't think, "Oh, okay, now we know that watches reproduce themselves." We would think, "Wow, this is a really intricate mechanism, right? There must be a very intelligent designer behind this mechanism." So the series of watches would not undercut the conclusion that we need a designer. Instead, it would strengthen the conclusion that we need a designer. Now, this analogy is aimed directly at the idea that the natural world is just a series of natural processes, right? The natural world sort of reproduces itself, if you want to think about it that way. It has some events, those events cause other events, and it's just a series of those events. Somebody who didn't want to agree that there was a God might think, look, the natural world is just a series of events like this. But Paley's analogy to the reproducing watches is supposed to make us think, hey, if the natural world can go on in this way, each event making more events and so on, that's really spectacular, right? That's more spectacular than we even thought. So it's extra evidence that the world has a designer. So that's the point of the reproducing watch analogy. Before signing off, I want to say one thing about this argument, which is that even if it works, right, even if it's supposed to convince us, and it does convince us, that there's a designer of some kind behind the world, it doesn't yet show us that the designer is anything like what the religions say the designer is like, right? So Christianity thinks of God as an all-powerful, almighty, all-good being, but Paley's argument just shows that there has to be some kind of designer, and we don't really know anything else about it. So it's consistent with Paley's argument that the designer is stupid, or evil, or absent-minded, or maybe there's a committee of designers that designed the whole world, something like that. Or maybe the designer, got bored one day and just decided to make something and then forgot about it. None of these things are anything like the Christian God, but for all we know, given Paley's argument, the designer could be like any of those things. Okay, that's where I'll stop this, and we'll have some more lectures next week.